Welcome to the GSMC Car Podcast, the show that takes you on a journey to the automotive world. We talk about the latest news, from new makes and models to new technology to all of the must-have options available. Whether you're a fan of the old classics, love the latest models and technology, or have never met a vehicle you didn't want to work on, the GSMC Car Podcast has something for every car enthusiast.
Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC Car Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, David Lucy Mabel. Okay, today, folks, we are going to be doing something slightly different. This is the first time that I have done this, but I think you all will enjoy it, and I think this will be very exciting. What we are going to be doing, a sort of face-off. It's going to be one car versus another, and I'm going to be talking about the first car in the first segment, talking about the second car in the second segment, talking about how they compare in the third segment, and in the fourth segment, I'm going to choose a winner. And this is going to be a two-part series on this specific type of automobile. We're going to be talking about the beloved European economy cars of old. So today we're going to be talking about the Volkswagen Beetle versus the Mini. And of course, we are going to be talking about the classic versions of each. So we're talking about, yes, the Volkswagen Type 1, the original Beetle, and we are going to be talking about the BMC Mini as it was officially, named the British Motor Corporation Mini, but it went by several different names: Austin Mini, Austin this, Wolseley this, Wolseley that. I mean, there was a lot of names for the classic Mini. So that's what we are going to be discussing today. So please stay tuned, and I hope you enjoy the podcast. So let's get started. We are going to be talking about the Volkswagen Beetle in the first segment of this podcast. It was officially called the Volkswagen Type 1. This is probably one of the most recognizable and one of the most famous cars of all time. There have been thousands of different types of cars produced, but everybody who knows anything can tell what a Volkswagen Beetle looks like. You don't have to be a car person. Heck, you don't have to be smart. You don't have to be an intellectual. You could live under a rock, but everybody knows what a Volkswagen Beetle is. And part of the reason why is because they are so common. Even today, I mean, Volkswagen Beetles and their variations are still fairly common cars. Think of it. 21,529,464 Volkswagen original Beetles were built from 1938 to 2003. Let us take a moment to appreciate that. 1938 to 2003. So you take 1938 to 2000 is 62 years, plus 3 more years. So that's 65 years. They produced the Volkswagen original Beetle. Some people don't even live to be 65 years old. I mean, 65 years is a lifetime for many people. So that is absolutely amazing. It was designed by Bella Barigny. Apparently, there's a bit of controversy about this. Typically, it has always been Ferdinand Porsche who was credited with the design of the Volkswagen Beetle. However, Bella Barigny had done the original design by 1925. And according to the Mercedes-Benz website, he is the one that they credit with designing the Volkswagen Beetle. Ferdinand Porsche had a hand in designing it, but he finalized the design in 1935 or something, before it finally went into production 1938. So that's the little bit of controversy about that I thought you all would like to know. This car is the brainchild of Adolf Hitler, who wanted a cheap car to be mass-produced for use on Germany's new roads. I'm not going to get into Hitler and what he did, but let's just say that this perhaps was the only good idea Hitler ever had in his entire existence, was the idea of the Volkswagen Beetle. And as horrible as this sounds, we have Hitler to thank for the Volkswagen Beetle, because if it were not for him, it may not have come along. Who knows? He wanted a people's car. In German, that translates to Volkswagen, which literally translates to English Volkswagen. So literally, it was a car for the people. It was the Volkswagen. So it was the Volkswagen. It was designed in the 30s. It entered civilian production, however, in the late 1940s because of World War II. So it was being produced. There were a handful of military versions produced, but civilian production began at the end of World War II in the mid-1940s, in 1945, and it continued to 2003 in various different places on Earth. The platform spawned a number of variants, including the Volkswagen Bus and the Karmann Ghia. So basically what Volkswagen did, they had this Type 1 chassis, which was the one underpinning the Beetle. And then they made the Type 2, they made the Type 3, the Type 4, the Ponton, all sorts of other designs that they just tacked onto this platform. So you would find that the Volkswagen Bus has the same platform and the same engine as the Volkswagen Beetle. Same thing with the Karmann Ghia. Very smart and very good in retrospect for people who want to buy one of these and restore them, because the Beetle was so common. I mean, these engines they're just, oh my gosh, they're a dime a dozen. I mean, they're super common. Even after the Beetle hasn't been produced in, 17 years, when you really think of it, that's not that long of a time. But even though it hasn't been produced for the past 17 years, and in the United States, it hasn't been produced since 1977, these things are still super common, and you can still find parts for them. So it's great for people who are trying to restore classic Volkswagen products that use this same platform, because the Beetle is everything you need. Moving on. When it comes to the car of the 20th century competition that came out in 1999, there were 4 cars that came, well, there were 5 cars, but the top 4 cars were the Ford Model T, the Mini, the Citroën DS, and, get this, the Volkswagen Beetle. It was considered the 4th most influential car of the 20th century. And frankly, it could have been one of the most influential cars of all time. Of course, we are still producing cars. Car production has not ended. We'll never be able to tell what was a car of all time. But the Volkswagen Beetle comes in there as one of the most influential car. One of the most influential cars of the 20th century, behind greats like the Ford Model T, the Mini, and the Citroën DS, which, honestly, I didn't think it would come behind the Mini, but I guess it did. I was going to think that the Mini would come behind it, but you'll soon find out in the next segment why the Mini is so acclaimed. The final iteration of the Flat 4 air-cooled engine had 40 horsepower. 40 horsepower wasn't enough for, I guess, modern day roads, but 40 horsepower was enough to provide the Volkswagen Beetle with enough power considering its size, I mean, these things weighed less than 2,000 pounds. They weighed like 1,500 to 1,800 pounds, and it was enough to, propel them onto the Autobahn, which was one of Hitler's requirements. His requirement was it had to have an air-cooled engine because, quote, not every doctor has a mechanic in their garage, and it had to be fast enough to handle the Autobahn at a reasonable cruising speed of the original engine produced 25 horsepower and propelled the car to 62 miles per hour. So the 40 horsepower engine might have done similar speed. Who knows? There wasn't any statistics on that, how much, but basically it had to be air cooled and it had to propel the car onto the Autobahn at reasonable cruising speed. Those were Hitler's requirements, and that Ferdinand Porsche did end up doing. However, the Volkswagen Beetle sales began to decline in the 70s. And the reason why is because the Japanese automakers were becoming more advanced. The Japanese automakers were becoming more advanced in the sense that they had water-cooled engines that were front of the car and rear-wheel drive. Their designs were a bit more advanced. You had offerings from Honda, offerings from Toyota, offerings from Nissan that sort of kind of pushed the antiquated Volkswagen Beetle out of the market. Because the thing is, as much as people love the Volkswagen Beetle, by 1977, especially in the United States when they officially stopped producing it, like they stopped, offering it for sale, by 1977, this thing was antiquated. I mean, you think production came, civilian production started in 1945 all the way to 1977. I mean, for the United States, that was, 32 years. 32 years of virtually unchanged design that's only been updated slightly over the years. I mean, people were getting tired of it after a while. But Volkswagen, to combat this, had their own water-cooled front-wheel drive engine vehicle, and that was the Volkswagen Golf. The Volkswagen Golf, however, did not come to replace the Beetle, but the Volkswagen Golf was a more modern offering. Think of it as, Lincoln Town Car versus Lincoln MKS. I know that's a strange comparison, but I know where I'm going with this. The Lincoln Town Car was the traditional luxury sedan made for Lincoln that the MKS did not come to replace, but the MKS was meant to be sold alongside of it for people who wanted a more modern offering. A Lincoln Town Car, body on frame, front engine, rear wheel drive, body, that sort of traditional construction, and then MKS, unibody, front-wheel drive, transversely mounted engine. They're still both full-size luxury sedans, just like these were both compact economy cars, but one was a traditional design, flat four, air-cooled engine, rear-wheel drive, and rear engine mounted, and then one was a front-wheel drive, water-cooled engine that was transversely mounted across the front axle. So that was basically Volkswagen's response to the Japanese automakers and what they were doing in North America at the time. As a result, in 1977, as I've mentioned before, Volkswagen ended up pulling out of the North American market with the Beetle, but they still continued several places across the world. I believe production in Brazil ended in 1996, and production in Mexico ended in 2003. So it was officially the end of the Volkswagen original Beetle. And the thing is, it was beautiful hearing about this and reading about it and knowing what they did. There was a ceremony on the production line that I just get chills thinking about it. I know I'm a weirdo. I get chills thinking about cars. But there was a ceremony on the production line officiating the end of the Volkswagen Beetle. The last 3,000 models were offered in a very special edition. They had color options. They had chrome trim, white wall tires, things that had been discontinued for a long time. But I remember seeing the picture in a textbook of all places. I don't really know why it was in the textbook now that I think of it, but I remember seeing a picture in the textbook about them thanking the Volkswagen Beetle for its service from 1938 to 2003, and it just made my heart very warm. Of course, now we know the Volkswagen New Beetle was a different car. The Volkswagen New Beetle was more of a modern novelty of anything than an actual economy car. What took the place of the economy car segment in Volkswagen was really the Golf. I mean, we're talking about North American market here because I know most of the people who are going to be listening to this are Americans. We're talking about the Golf. That really came, and that was the economy car. So that was the real successor to the Volkswagen Beetle. But the Volkswagen New Beetle was water-cooled, front-wheel drive. It had a design based on the original Beetle, and that Volkswagen New Beetle came in 2 generations. And they actually stopped producing the Volkswagen Beetle in 2019, which I am not a Volkswagen Beetle aficionado. I am not an economy car sort of person. I'm not a small car sort of person. I like my big American luxury land yachts. But that made me incredibly sad because the Volkswagen Beetle was not dead yet. They forced it to die. They euthanized it. They did not let it die naturally. It could have come out as an electric vehicle. There was never a hybrid version. I mean, there were turbo diesel versions, there were gas versions, there were naturally aspirated, blah, 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 all of that. But they didn't come out with a hybrid or an electrical version. I mean, with all the work going into hybrid and electrical cars nowadays to make them viable to fight against gas engines, why not take such a platform that would be perfectly suited to that and create an EV or at least a hybrid or a plug-in hybrid or something? I mean, you could be like a fun little hybrid car, which I know hybrid cars aren't fun. But Volkswagen had the potential to create a fun hybrid car, to create a fun, electric vehicle that people were attached to, people were drawn to. Because when you think of it, electric vehicles are odd. They just are. I mean, Tesla's weird. Tesla's kind of like, they're still kind of like that really pretentious, bougie, upper middle class, rich class, a car that you get because, you're trying to be green, you're trying to save the environment, blah, 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 nah, nah, nah. But like Volkswagen Beetle, that was a people's car. I mean, even after it no longer was technically an economy car, people still bought them. I mean, there could have been an electric vehicle version of that if they figured that the gas vehicle was dead. I mean, they could have done something about that. But unfortunately, they did it. They decided to kill the Beetle, and I still think about it to this day. And I was just talking to my girlfriend about it the other day, and it just made me sad. I mean, I know that's an odd thing to talk to your girlfriend about, the demise of the Volkswagen Beetle. But hey, when you're a car guy, anything goes. So please stay tuned for the next segment, however, because we're going to be talking about the BMC Mini, otherwise known as the Classic Mini. There are lots of things to know about this car, so please stay tuned. I hope you're excited for the next segment.
Are you a business owner? Someone interested in the latest news that might affect your business? Then check out the GSMC Business News Podcast, a show dedicated to keeping you up to date on all things concerning business, technology, and the stock market. Get a head start on the day as we keep you updated on the latest goings-on Wall Street, money, jobs, and technology. The GSMC Business News Podcast has you covered.
All right, welcome back, folks. So in this segment, we are going to be talking about the BMC Mini, the British Motor Corporation's Mini. And in the last segment, we spoke about the Volkswagen Beetle. We spoke about the history of the Volkswagen Beetle and the legacy that it's left behind. So we're going to be doing the same, but for the Mini this time. This was originally produced by the British Motor Corporation, hence why I call it the BMC Mini. I don't know if it was ever actually officially known as the BMC Mini, but that was the manufacturer and that was the model name. BMC was the manufacturer for the first few years, and then the model name was Mini. However, it was produced under a variety of names, including Austin Mini, Austin Cooper, Wolseley Hornet, Innocenti Mini, and there were so many more that we just can't even think about, honestly, at this point. But this car, what made this car so famous, and the reason why it's so beloved across the world, is that it revolutionized space-saving measures in car design. It was a front engine, transversely mounted, and front-wheel drive. Now, this car came out in 1959. That was not a common setup for cars back then. Cars back then typically were body-on-frame construction, front-wheel drive, front engine, rear-wheel drive cars, just like the traditional American sedans. That's how most cars were built. So the fact that they mass-produced a car that was a unibody construction, that was front-wheel drive, and with an engine that was transversely mounted across the front axle, meaning was horizontally placed instead of vertically placed so it could drive the rear wheels through a drive shaft. This car was amazing, because what that allowed it to do was that 80% of the floor pan space used for passengers, or 80% of the floor pan space was able to be used for passengers and their luggage. Now, we're talking about a car that is, oh my goodness, maybe 13 feet long. I mean, like, I'm being real generous. I think it was like 12 to 14 feet long. So I'm gonna say 14 feet long. Everything was metric, and I'm American. I don't use metric. I don't know how to do that. But, like, we're talking about a car that's 13 feet long, maybe, that is able to comfortably seat, relatively, 4 adults and their luggage. I mean, that is ridiculous. The floor was flat, and I know that's a huge deal. Because even in front-wheel drive cars, I drive a front-wheel drive car, my floor is not flat. Why is there a transmission hump in the middle when the transmission doesn't go that far back and there's no drive shaft? I have absolutely no clue. But the floor is flat. Think of your minivans. Minivans have flat floors. Think of your Japanese K cars. I know most of you all aren't Japanese, but in Japan, they have K cars that follow very much the same setup, that have flat floors as well. This truly revolutionized space-saving techniques in the car world. It truly revolutionized so many things. I mean, like, I can't even think about how many cars the design of the original Mini end up influencing. So we're going to move on. But it lasted from 1959 to 2000. So that is a whopping 41 years. Not as long as the Volkswagen Beetle, but you will find it was just as prolific, if not even more prolific and more accomplished than the Volkswagen Beetle. Just like I said, marketed over so many different marques. And I want to say this. This was, in my opinion, very smart for BMC at first. Then it was British Leyland, or Leland, however you want to pronounce that. And then there was the Rover Group. And then towards the very end, BMW took control of the Rover Group and acquired the rights to the Mini name and whatnot, and started producing it. But those new Minis that were being produced from 2000 onward were not the same Minis as the classic Minis of old. But think of it this way. They produced it under so many different marques. So there are so many different cars out there that are actually Minis, but that weren't called Minis. They were marketed in so many different places across Europe. I mean, I've seen these cars in Japan. I don't think, however, I don't think they ever came to the United States, funny enough. But don't quote me on that. But I don't remember ever hearing or seeing an American spec of a Classic Mini. Maybe I have to look it up. But they were produced in Australia. They were produced in England. They were produced in all over the place. In Italy, the Italian one was called the Innocenti Mini. I mean, there are so many different versions of this, which is such a smart marketing technique because you create a product that is recognizable throughout all of its different markets. However, it has a different name, so other companies are able to produce this car under license through their own manufacturing means, if you will. But they know that you own the design, you own this, they produce it under license, so they pay you for it. I mean, that is so smart. So smart, so smart, so smart, so smart. I mean, it's amazing. I thought that was a great idea. And I had always been confused until I had done the research for the car because I was like, well, what's the difference? Is it an Austin Rover? Is it this? Is it that? Like, what's the difference between all of them? The funny thing is there is no difference. They're just different versions of the car produced by different brands who used it under license from the original designers, which was BMC and then ended up being British Leyland and then ended up being the Rover Group. So moving on from that, we have so many different things that the Mini was known for. It was popular as a race and rally car. There were several different updates, not quite different enough to be considered different generations. They were just sort of refreshes over the years. There was the Mini Mark 1, the Mark 2, the Mark 3, the Mark 4, and I believe they finally ended on the Mark 5 or the Mark 6. All of these had an inline-4 engine as opposed to the Volkswagen Beetle's flat-4. This was a water-cooled engine, I believe, that was a front-wheel drive, and that, that was a more modern design from the very beginning than the Volkswagen Beetle. The Mini Cooper was a high-performance version of the Mini. So the original Mini Cooper, the classic Mini Cooper, was created by John Cooper. John Cooper, I believe, was a race car driver. And then he merged together, or not merged, he collaborated with one of the people from, the companies that were producing Mini and decided to produce his own version of it that was high-performance, that was, based off of the racing spec a bit. So that's how the name Mini Cooper came along. And to all of the people out there who are listening, I mean, this has become sort of the general name for the Mini. They're all called Mini Coopers. They're technically not Mini Coopers, but that's what they've been known to be called as. And we partially have BMW to thank for that, because when they came out with the modern Mini in the 2000 model year, after the original Mini had ceased production, they called it the Mini Cooper. So here's what I think so far of the Mini Cooper. Of course, you'll hear more of my thoughts later as I compare the two cars and as I finally choose a winner in segment 4. But the Mini Cooper is an amazing car. I mean, it was so versatile, more so than the Volkswagen Beetle, I'd say. I mean, this car raced, it did this, it did that, it wore many hats. I mean, there was a not the Volkswagen, there was a station wagon version of it, called the Mini Clubman. It was a car that was not only beloved, it was well known, and it was versatile as well. Not all car companies can claim to do that. I can think about how this revolutionized modern car design. I will have you know that most cars nowadays are front-engine, front-wheel drive cars with transversely mounted engines. I'm not saying that Mini came up with this idea, but Mini certainly popularized the idea. I believe the first front-wheel drive cars, at least some of the first front-wheel drive cars, were Cords. I can do a podcast on Cord in the future, but basically there was Auburn, Duesenberg, Cord. They were all under the Auburn umbrella. They were all produced in Auburn, Indiana, I believe. And Cord was kind of like their experimental, their exploratory mark, if I can put it that way. That's when they did all the new stuff. Cords were front-wheel drive, and we're talking about way back in the 20s and 30s here. Cords were front-wheel drive, many of them. I believe the Cord 812 was the most famous front-wheel drive model they had. But If Cord was one that kind of brought it into production, brought it into sort of popularity, I mean, Mini was the one that really brought it home, that really took the front wheel drive platform into the home run. I'm thinking even my large American luxury sedan that currently sits out in my driveway right now is a front wheel drive unibody construction car with a transversely mounted engine. Guess what was also a front wheel drive car, unibody construction with a transversely mounted engine? The Mini, the Austin Mini, the classic Mini. I think that was very important because when it came to mass producing cars, and especially that this car wanted to be produced cheaply, wanted to maximize the amount of space, wanted to be the people's car, at least the British people's car, it had to maximize space. It had to maximize space. It had to appeal to what the people needed. They needed something cheap. They needed something that was spacious, and they needed something that wasn't going to take up much space. So the thing is, you find a car that's real small, but also real big. Because it's small on the outside, but once you enter, it's almost as if though it's an optical illusion. It's a lot bigger on the inside than you would expect it to be. I sat in one of these, and this is true. I mean, albeit what I sat in was a Mini Clubman. It was slightly larger than an Austin Mini, but still, it was very large on the inside from what I can remember. There was one on display at some ice cream shop in Tokyo that I went to last year, and I got to sit inside of it and take pictures. And it's actually surprisingly big in there. You would never expect that. I, as a 6 foot tall person, had no problem fitting in. Absolutely no problem whatsoever. I mean, the only thing I can complain about was the fact that I kind of had to bend down a little bit to get in, but once I was in, I fit snugly. I mean, I had enough space to move around. I had space to move my arms, other things of that sort. I mean, it wasn't as cramped as people might think of economy cars. So it was an amazing idea that not only provided people with a cheap car, they provide something spacious, and it also revolutionized how cars would be produced from then on. Honda Civics are front-wheel drive, water-cooled engines with transversely mounted orientations over the front axle. Keeping with that formula, you have Toyota Corollas, you have Nissan Sentras, you have so many different cars of across the world that are that same sort of formula. I mean, you get Ford Focus. You get even some of the larger cars, Ford Fusion, Ford Taurus. We're going to go into luxury cars now. Cadillac CTS was one of these cars. I think the CTS nowadays is rear-wheel drive, but the original CTS was front-wheel drive. I mean, you get even the Cadillac DeVilles from the 1980s and onward were front-wheel drive cars, unibody construction. I mean, this is crazy. This is crazy. This sort of idea filtered itself over all segments of the car market. Like I said, it's not like it was Mini that did it first, but Mini popularized it and saw how viable it was to produce a car that had an engine transversely mounted over the front axles and that was able to drive the front wheels while still maintaining a lot of space on the interior of the car and making it, a viable option instead of the rear-wheel drive body-on-frame construction that was so common for such a long time. So, please stay tuned for the next segment. I'm going to be comparing the two side by side. And we are going to be talking in the fourth segment about which I believe is the winner of this face-off, if you will, of these beloved European economy cars of old. So please stay tuned.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching.
Hey!
The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be, visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
All right, folks, thank you for listening this far into the podcast. This is segment 3. In the last 2 segments, we talked about the Volkswagen Beetle. In the first segment, we talked about the BMC Mini. In the last segment, also known as the Classic Mini. And now in this segment, we are going to be discussing, or at least comparing the two side by side, in 4 categories here. In influence, in styling, in legacy, and in technology. So let's get started. Concerning the influence of both of the cars, the influence of the Volkswagen Beetle is far and wide. The influence, I would say, of the Volkswagen Beetle is sort of a pop culture influence. I mean, we all grew up on, school buses or on long car rides. You saw a Volkswagen Beetle, whether it be an old one or a new one, and you punched the person next to you, and you said, punch buggy, no punch backs, and of course you had to say the color, because if you didn't say the color, you were going to get punched back, because that was a silly rule that they had. That is such a pop culture icon, the Volkswagen Beetle. It has infiltrated itself into the culture, into the psyche of children, into the psyche of adults, into everybody. Everybody knows what a Volkswagen Beetle is, which is why I originally thought that, oh man, after the Ford Model T, obviously the Volkswagen Beetle would be second place for the most revolutionary car or the most influential car of the 20th century. But then I started doing research on the Mini. Well, you see, the Mini's influence went way beyond just pop culture. I mean, the Mini's influence had a huge influence in pop culture, indeed, especially in British pop culture. But what made it so amazing was the fact that the Mini formula of front-wheel drive, unibody construction, transversely mounted engine to save space and to be easier to produce has been copied in some way, shape, or form by nearly every single car manufacturer on the face of the earth. Name any car manufacturer. We're not talking about truck manufacturer, like GMC wouldn't count in this, but name any car manufacturer out there that doesn't have a front-wheel drive car with a transversely mounted engine. I can't think of anyone. Literally every car manufacturer has a version of that original design. I'm not talking about original design like, oh, they're all producing Minis. I'm talking about that original design and concept. Like, wow, this is a front-wheel drive car with a transversely mounted engine designed to save as much space as possible. Literally every car I can think of, or every car company I can think of, has a car that follows that same basic formula. This is much beyond just pop culture. Because when you think of it, the Volkswagen Beetle had influence indeed. But how many cars have flat 4 engines that are rear-mounted, rear-wheel drive, and are air-cooled? None. That's such an antiquated design. It's not modern. I mean, granted, Subarus still have flat four engines. Porsches still have flat engines that are rear mounted, but air-cooled. Porsches are no longer air-cooled. And really, is it even that much of an influence if it's even Porsche that did it? Because, as you know, Volkswagen and Porsche are owned by the same company. They're Volkswagen Auto Group. And Ferdinand Porsche was the one who finalized the design of the Volkswagen Beetle. So the Volkswagen and the Porsche, Volkswagen Beetle and the Porsche are relatives. So it's not even that great of an influence if Porsches still use flat engines that are rear mounted. It's not that much of an influence. The influence hadn't spread that much. So when you really think of it, no cars outside of the Volkswagen Auto Group use this formula, flat four engines that are rear wheel drive. And that was what the Volkswagen Beetle was for. I mean, the Volkswagen Beetle, granted, had its heyday. It had its purpose. It had its place. But the Volkswagen Beetle's formula, basic formula, flat four engine, air-cooled, rear-wheel drive, rear-mounted, blah, 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 is not viable anymore. People don't do that anymore. That's old, that's antiquated, that's old news. People just they simply just don't do that anymore. However, Mini's formula of front-wheel drive, transversely mounted engine over the front axle is still alive and well. Like I said, I can't think of a single car manufacturer out there who doesn't have a variation of that original design I told you about. Mini popularized it, and it's still very popular today. In fact, all of the cars that I've owned have used this formula. Front-wheel drive cars. I've owned 2 Cadillac DeVilles, a Honda Civic, and a Buick Park Avenue. They all use that same sort of layout. So that's something that is really infiltrated deep into car culture, deep into car design. The idea of, saving space by flipping the engine around, making it horizontal, putting it over the front axle, and making the front wheels drive themselves. That is truly amazing. And that's why I think in terms of influence, I mean, the influence of the Austin Mini or the BMC Mini or whatever you want to call it is much greater than the influence of the Volkswagen Beetle. Talk about styling. I know styling may be sort of, I don't know, maybe it might be considered vanity to spend so much time talking about the styling of a vehicle. But heck, I'm a car enthusiast, and chances are if you're listening to this podcast, you're also a car enthusiast. So styling matters to us. The Volkswagen Beetle styling was very cute. Very cute, very lovable, very distinctive. But I will say, it doesn't age well. The Volkswagen New Beetle is not a pretty car. It's overtly round, overtly feminine, overtly it looks like a caricature of the original Volkswagen Beetle. It looks like it grew up and ate too many cookies, and then now it's sort of fat, sort of kind of roly-poly sort of version of the nice original slimmed down version of the Volkswagen Beetle. Yeah, the styling just doesn't age well. It's classic. It is beloved, but it is not a styling that has aged well particularly. However, you take the styling of the Mini. The styling of the Mini, in one way, shape, or form, is still very much alive and well today. And the reason why I'm going to say that is take a modern Volkswagen Beetle and take a modern Mini Cooper and compare it to the car of old. You will find that the Mini Cooper retains more of the original styling than the Volkswagen does. And here's why I say that, is because the Mini had a design that was very plain and inoffensive from the start. And plain and inoffensive designs, as we have all well known over the years, tend to age very well. This is why Jeep can continue milking the same formula from the original Willys Jeep as far as the design goes. This is why the Jeep Grand Wagoneer was able to milk its formula for that long as far as design goes. This is why the Mercedes-Benz G-Wagon has been able to milk its design as far as design goes for so long. This is why so many cars that have relatively unchanged designs over their entire history have been able to milk their designs for so long, is because the designs were plain and inoffensive from the start, so they end up aging well. So you will find that even the most modern Minis still look very, very, very similar to the Minis of old. Of course, they've grown a lot larger, but they didn't grow to the point where they looked overweight. They grew to the point where they looked more muscular than the ones of old. The Volkswagen Beetle, however, grew and it looked fat. I mean, it looked not obese. Obese is rude. Obese is a rude term to describe a car, but it looked out of shape. I mean, it didn't look as good and as trim as the first one. And that, I believe, has done the car a disservice as far as styling goes. Because the second generation Volkswagen Beetle, the one that I'm really harping on, not to say is a bad car, but frankly, it just looks like a girl's car. And it doesn't help that so many people have modified them to have, daisy hubcaps and eyelashes around the headlights and other sorts of girly frilly things. And that Barbie had a Volkswagen Beetle. I mean, come on. This is a car we're talking about. I mean, I'm not saying that women don't have the right to enjoy car design. Of course, everybody has the right to enjoy car design, but it's overtly feminine. I mean, it's like they marketed with that design specifically towards women. They said something ridiculous, 70% of people who bought Volkswagen New Beetles were women or girls. I mean, that's crazy. And then the third generation that was just recently discontinued ended up having a more muscular design that was more appealing to both men and women. That's probably the best looking one. But the design hasn't aged as well as Mini's design. Mini's design is cute, but Mini's design isn't overtly feminine. And not only that, it's been able to retain most of the original styling as far as the current counterpart is that's retro design. It's been able to retain most of its styling. It doesn't look extremely. It looks like a good evolution of what came before. Volkswagen Beetle, not so much. So in styling, I mean, I believe that the Mini has it. In legacy, okay, legacy is a tough one here, because what are we speaking of legacy? Are we speaking of the impact that it's left? Or are we speaking of whether they're still being produced or not? Or is it a combination of the both? I mean, I think it's a combination of the both in this category, frankly. The legacy that the Volkswagen Beetle has left behind as the most produced single model automobile of all time, surpassing the Ford Model T, is something that is very, very difficult to beat. I mean, you've got a couple of cars out there as some of the most produced platforms of all time, but this is one of the most produced single cars of all time. Like I said, that's difficult to beat. Almost 22 million of these original Beetles were built. That is a legacy that is hard to outshine. But I will say, though, the Mini, on the other hand, didn't produce nearly as much. It wasn't as prolific as far as numbers go. But the idea of the Mini has been far outsold than the idea of the Volkswagen Beetle. And let me tell you, the same idea, front-wheel drive, transversely mounted engine. Just think about how many cars fit that formula. Mini revolutionized it, but their legacy lives on, not just in British cars, in cars all over the world. So I'll let you be the decider of that. Is it numbers? Is it quantity? Or is it quality? Is it a quantitative analysis or is it a qualitative analysis? Are you going to be looking about the sheer numbers of the car produced? Or are you going to be looking about the quality of the car and what sorts of qualities that it had that live on today? So I'll let you be the decider of that. And last but not least, we're going to be talking about technology. Technology that really just wraps itself up into the influence into the legacy version. Legacy. The technology of the Mini is still very much alive and well today as far as its design goes, as far as certain things that it utilized, flat floors, storage compartments, under seats, things of that sort. Volkswagen Beetle, however, besides the flat floor engine and debuting what's known as a swing axle that was also used in the Chevy Corvair. I mean, those things lasted, but they don't still exist to this day as far as viable car options, viable car alternatives, or viable car building methods, whatever you want to put it. They're just not present in cars today. So that's another thing for you to decide. But please stay tuned for the last segment in which I declare a winner and I tell you my personal thoughts about it. So please stay tuned.
Do you work in the world of marketing and advertising? Are you a media buyer or the owner of an agency? Have you been looking for a podcast to help stay on top of all the goings-on of those worlds? The GSMC Marketing News Podcast is dedicated to keeping you up to date on all things concerning marketing and advertising. Get the latest marketing news, from what major businesses have planned for the coming year, to the newest trends in advertising, from podcasts, digital and streaming, to the old standbys of radio, television, and billboards. The GSMC Marketing News Podcast has you covered, whether you're a marketing agent or a business trying to expand your brand.
All right, welcome back to the Car Podcast. In this last segment, I'm going to be discussing between the Volkswagen Beetle and the Mini Cooper, which car holds my heart, which car I declare is the winner as far as my personal opinion goes. I'm going to be telling you more of my personal opinion about that car. So we looked at the Volkswagen Beetle and we looked at the Mini side by side in the last segment. Which one wins? That's a difficult question. I know, I swear, I'm going to choose one, but before, let me explain. Because I'm sort of torn. I can go the car enthusiast route and go purely off of emotion, what I think is the best car, or I can go a business route and think with my brain and be like, actually, this is what's probably the best car of the two. If I were to choose emotionally with my heart alone, I would choose the Volkswagen Beetle. Volkswagen Beetle, simply because of how it's influenced our culture. And not only that, it's no longer being produced, and we miss it. We miss it terribly, and we wish it were to come back. If I were going off of a business standpoint, I would say the BMC Mini. BMC Mini, because even though it wasn't as prolific as far as the numbers of a Volkswagen Beetle goes, it wasn't produced for nearly as long either. The Volkswagen has a good 20 years over the production of the Mini. The fact is, the Mini, the sorts of design and sorts of space-saving techniques that it pioneered were insane. It was insane. I mean, the sorts of things that it did were like, what? Like, oh my gosh, you can transversely mount an engine in a car, blah, blah, blah. I mean, not to say it hadn't been done before, but that it became so popular, that it became such a viable option. I mean, that's something that we're still riding the coattails of that much, much later on. So it is what it is. I mean, I'm going to have to choose the Volkswagen Beetle. I got you. The reason why I'm going to choose the Volkswagen Beetle is because I'm a car enthusiast. I am emotional. Cars are an emotional thing for me. I'm going to have to choose the Volkswagen Beetle as the winner here. I know it doesn't make sense on paper, really, about why the Volkswagen Beetle is a better or is the winner in this competition, because the Mini has beat it out in almost every single category that I discussed in the last segment. The influence. The Mini... the Mini has a lot greater influence. Instead of just pop culture influence, the Mini has a lot greater influence as far as design and business decisions go when it comes to car manufacturers. Styling, the Mini styling was a lot more understated from the very beginning, so it still lives on today in a very much unchanged fashion. The legacy of the Mini is a lot greater than the legacy of the Volkswagen Beetle, in the sense that the idea that the Mini had made so prolific is still being produced. And the technology, the Mini was leaps and bounds more, modern than the Volkswagen Beetle anyway, because the original design of the Volkswagen Beetle came out in 1925. It started being produced in the 1930s. I mean, the Mini was pretty much designed and built in the 1950s, which was a much more modern era of car design in the 1920s, as we all so well know. But the reason why I choose the Volkswagen Beetle is simply because of the pop culture and the emotional value that it has. Oh my gosh. Think of it. 65 years of production. So many different countries, so many different continents, so many different places across the world. Not every person can tell you what a Mini looks like. I know most can, but not every person can tell you what a Mini looks like. And a lot of people might even think that the Mini is a modern car. They might not even know that the Mini had a classic version. When you're talking about the unchurched car people, and not by church, like religious church, but like, the traditions of car. Let's say the car culture was kind of like, your church. And then the people who are unchurched, meaning the people who are uncar cultured, if I could put it that way. It's all the unchurched car folk out there. They might not even know that there was a classic Mini. Everybody knows that there was a classic Volkswagen Beetle. Everybody knows one person who had a Volkswagen Beetle. Everybody knows a story about a Volkswagen Beetle. Everybody's seen a Volkswagen Beetle. Everybody knows a person who has a Volkswagen Beetle that has a project car. And if they don't know someone, they know someone who knows someone. I mean, this is ridiculous. This is all over the world we're talking about here. All over the world. I mean, if Hitler wanted to conquer the world, he never did. But his idea of the Volkswagen Beetle ended up far-reaching a lot more than he could reach his Third Reich, thank goodness. But his idea of the Volkswagen Beetle ended up reaching way far than he could ever hope to. Because of, frankly, it was a good idea. The only good idea the man ever had, but this was a good idea. I mean, the Volkswagen Beetle was revolutionary as far as the sort of impact that it had on the psyche of people, the sort of impact that it had on the car culture, the sort of impact that it had up until modern times. And I would say, from an emotional standpoint, from a car enthusiast standpoint, I will be a lot sadder to see the Volkswagen Beetle go than I will be to see Mini go. Mini is still being produced, and Mini doesn't show any signs of going anytime soon. But here's the thing. Mini are all German cars now. They're just BMWs. I mean, Mini is owned by BMW. Mini is being produced by BMW. Mini is not even a British car at this point. Mini is a German car. And you know how I feel about German cars, even though, ironically, the Volkswagen Beetle is a German car. So I guess the Germans had the last laugh at the end of the day, because the British can't even produce their own car anymore. But even though the Mini is a German car, and people have mixed feelings about the German car, the Mini has become much more of a mainstream option. I know it's not a mainstream option, but it's become so much more common. It's almost as if though it's been watered down. The Mini is no longer something special anymore. I mean, you see a Mini, and you're like, that's a Mini. But you see a Volkswagen Beetle, you're like, punch buggy, no punchback. I mean, the Mini doesn't garner that reaction because they're becoming so common now. I mean, granted, funny enough, the Mini was already a common car. But the classic Mini is not so common anymore because they haven't been produced in such a long time. And the modern Mini has sort of become a watered-down version of that in a sense, because now it's nothing special to own a Mini so much anymore. I mean, I don't know, it's sort of, I hope you all understand what I'm trying to get at here. It's not as special anymore, but a Volkswagen Beetle is still special. It's still special. I mean, you still say punch buggy, no punchbacks when you see one. You still revel about how cute it is. A Mini is not so much. The Minis have grown large. The Minis have grown into more of a mainstream car, which granted, the Mini has been more successful than the Volkswagen Beetle as far as keeping its design on the road, keeping its viability. But the Mini, there's the Mini Cooper. There's like a racing version of the Mini now. John Cooper Works or something. There's a Mini Clubman. There's a Mini that's practically a crossover SUV. I mean, it's normal now. Volkswagen Beetle never got to be that prolific. It was always the same sort of formula, two-door coupe. And it was once rear-wheel drive, it became front-wheel drive as it progressed into the modern era. But it was always a two-door coupe. It was always recognizable. You never saw a Volkswagen Beetle and you're like, oh, well, that's weird. And the thing is, I guess the reason why is because Volkswagen Beetle had always been a model of Volkswagen, not its own car. It wasn't like Beetle Motor Company or whatnot. Mini, however, started out as a model, but became its own company. So the modern Mini Corporation obviously had to produce a lot more cars under a lot more different variations in order to appeal to the current car market. So I guess that's what it is at the end of the day. So thank you so much for listening to the GSMC Car Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. If you like this podcast, please leave us a like, a follow on Facebook, anything that really helps us. Tell your friends about us and tell them about how much I love the Volkswagen Beetle, and hopefully they'll be inclined to listen. So please stay tuned for the next one, in which the second part of this series, if you will, is when I'm going to be discussing the Citroën 2CV versus the Fiat 500, which are like the French Volkswagen Beetle and the Italian Volkswagen Beetle, if I could put it that way. Much lesser known here in the United States. So, have a good night. Thank you so much for listening.
You've been listening to the GSMC Car Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type GSMC into your favorite podcast app to find all of the shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, from business news to weird news. Please subscribe to the podcast and follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you've enjoyed today's episode.